It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this next session, The Future of Food, which is Oscar Yoon, the president of Ipsos Strategy 3. Oscar, you have the floor.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Ellen, and welcome back. For those of you that have been with us all day, thank you for your stamina. Hope you're not suffering too much Zoom fatigue. And for those of you that are just joining us, welcome. As Ellen said, this session is about the future of food. And for those of you that don't know, we at Ipsos have a publication which we call WTF, which stands for What the Future. We do a series of these publications over a number of topics. We've done the future of beauty, the future of money, the future of mobility, the future of housing. Today we're focusing on the future of food. So what we'll do is we'll talk about some of the changes that are happening in the food industry. Jeff Freeman, President and CEO of the Consumer Brands Association, will give us a keynote on how the pandemic has inspired near and longer term changes in the food industry. Then I'll have a fireside chat one-on-one with Julia Oswald, who is a global decision science and analytics lead at Kellogg and Company. And then we'll round out our discussion just to bring in some different perspectives with a panel discussion. So before we begin, I just want to share some context on what we see kind of from the future of food and some of the things we've been studying. You don't need to look at me there. But I think what's interesting is while the past several years, we've seen have a discussion on much discussed, food trends, right? Whether that's how we eat, we talk a lot about the increase in snacking, right? People are eating smaller meals over the course of a day. Snacking is gaining increasing importance. We talk a lot about what people are eating. I don't think we need to talk about health and wellness. I think we're all well aware of kind of what's happening in the health and wellness space. And we also talk a lot about where and how people eat, right? So convenience and delivery, whether that's Uber Eats or getting a meal kit delivered to your home. These trends are things that we in the food industry have talked about a lot over the past several years. But I think we all know, and I'm sure this has been a thread throughout today, is the past several months have really introduced some changes that could be quite important and quite long-lasting in our industry. And if we think that all the time, but if you think about what we ask consumers, you see that consumers are changing, right? They're saying, I'm eating a lot more at home. I'm open to trying new recipes, 78%. Open to trying new foods, 72%. I try new food brands. There's an openness to really explore, which is really interesting. I'm surprised how few people's cooking skills have improved, but it is an interesting kind of exploration now that people are rethinking about themselves as okay, now I'm kind of on my own to start creating meals, right? And I want to try new things. At the same time, we're seeing there's this eagerness to eat out, but it's balanced by this idea that, delivery actually is a good alternative, right? There's good alternatives, and I plan to get more delivery than I did before the pandemic. So there's some obviously important ramifications to our restaurant industry. That said, I think we seem to be seeing a move further away from what's familiar and normal, right? We think for a while we thought things were moving back. If you look at the blue lines, which are June, and then the orange lines, which are July, going to a grocery store, we did a lot more of that last month than we did actually 2 months in June than in July. Same thing in dining in restaurants. And so those of you that were part of my session earlier this morning or this afternoon, you also see this chart, which is showing that consumers are actually moving backwards as we experience the pandemic, and that's an unfortunate situation that we're in, right? Driven by just the pure numbers and the science of it, that consumers were May, June kind of progressing, and you kind of see slowly moving backwards towards some of the earlier stages of the pandemic, which is, as I said, a challenging place to be in. So given all of this context, people want to cook more, they're missing eating out, they're a little bit nervous about going back into society. I think the key question we want to answer is, how, what, and where are we going to eat in the future, right? What are we going to eat in the future? And for that, I'd like to welcome Jeff. Hold on 1 second here, flipping my pages around. Jeff Freeman. Jeff Freeman is President and CEO of the Consumer Brands Association. It's a trade association for America's 2.1 trillion, that's right, trillion with a T, food, beverage, and consumer goods products industry. Since he took the helm, Jeff has launched a strategic campaign to transform the association into a powerful, modern advocacy organization aimed at driving growth across the industry. So Jeff, over to you.
Oscar, thank you, and big thank you to you, the whole team at Ipsos, for this invitation. I hope I can answer some of the questions you posed, but appreciate the opportunity to be here. You mentioned the Consumer Brands Association. We represent all aspects of the consumer packaged goods industry, everybody from Coke to Clorox and Pepsi to Procter and Gamble, and you can imagine the demand for those products over the past several months. Some of you may have known Consumer Brands as the Grocery Manufacturers Association in the past. Over the last 2 years, we've entirely reimagined the organization and officially rebranded in January of this year. 2 months later, everything seemed to change, not just for us, but certainly for everyone else. The world's a different place now, and the essential nature of CPG products and the 20 million Americans tied to making those products has never before been so well understood. Leaders in the industry tell me that the past 5 months have fast-forwarded 10 years of change. What I'd like to do today is summarize what I see as the 5 most significant changes, some of which I think are flying below the radar. So I look forward to discussing those, and hopefully it'll lead a little bit to your conversation that happens after this. The number one thing that has changed is the immense amount of newfound trust that the consumer brands, the consumer packaged goods industry has earned over the last several months. In early March, 37% of Americans said they had more trust in the CPG industry and its ability to deliver in America's time of need. Today, nearly 50% of Americans say they have more trust in the industry, and the numbers continue to grow. The industry has done everything in its power to meet skyrocketing demand because it had to. Americans can't stay at home and stay safe without our products. And while the average consumer may not think about the people behind the boxes on the shelves, this is a human-powered industry that has worked tirelessly behind the scenes to deliver. What does that newfound trust mean for the business? I think 2 things come to mind. One is it's an opportunity for storied brands. Think Duncan Hines and Lysol, which was started in 1889. It's an opportunity for them to reintroduce themselves to a new generation of customers. That's huge when you consider the way things were trending in some various categories. The second I think it means is a more difficult environment in the immediate future for upstart entrepreneurs to make inroads among consumers. More than ever, people are turning to the brands they trust, the legacy brands, and I think that does create a little bit more difficult of an environment for those upstarts. Today, the trust and power lie with brands that Americans know and can count on. That's point number one. The second point I would make is that we've entered what I like to call the golden era of supply chain. No one talked about supply chain a year ago, at least not in company where we wanted to keep the conversation going. Today, it's a different situation. In January, we released a report looking at what was on the minds of CPG executives for 2020. At the time, we said that many of the issues CPG companies contend with on a daily basis were invisible to consumers. We had no idea how visible those issues were about to become. Just weeks after the report's release, supply chain, perhaps the most invisible issue to consumers before COVID-19, became kitchen table conversation as panic buying emptied store shelves. The complexity of bringing consumer packaged goods into the home has never before been so widely on display. And the opportunities for enhancing supply chain performance and resiliency have never before been so pressing. Supply chains long prioritized just-in-time delivery that reduced costs. The pandemic was a lesson that resiliency is just as important. During the peak of COVID crisis response, long-honed demand algorithms were pushed aside in favor of real-time decision-making and human judgment. CPG manufacturers, retailers, carriers, they all realized the need to revisit conventional ways of doing business and accelerate change. So here are some of the ways that I think we are going to be looking at supply chain differently in the months and years ahead that could have quite significant impact on the industry. Number one, I think we're about to see more governmental interest in where items are sourced and manufactured and our dependency on foreign markets. Two, I think we'll see significant investment and transformation to meet consumer demand in the direct-to-consumer and e-commerce space. We're all seeing that. I'm going to touch on that more in a moment. Three, I think we've seen a permanently changed perception of supply chains, no longer just about creating efficiencies, but about growing the business and serving as a key differentiator in the marketplace. Fourthly, we're about to see increased questions about inventory levels and what should be done to create greater resiliency in times of crisis. This is going to be a big issue across the industry as COVID wanes. And finally, I think we're about to see substantial innovation, new technologies, and time and cost-saving measures to bring products to market. For example, Consumer Brands recently launched a contactless delivery task force featuring more than 35 retailers and manufacturers to make the delivery experience safer and less cumbersome. We're working with regulators to ensure inspection and other regulatory activities continue while keeping workers safe. We're able to look at things and create new programs that we couldn't have got off the ground 6 months ago, but there's great demand for that. Expect to see tremendous change in the world of supply chain. Let me turn to the third issue, and I touched on that momentarily, and that is the emergence of e-commerce. Grocery has been one of the last bastions of brick and mortar stores, but the pandemic has propelled the growth of e-commerce, and now online purchasing is understood, embraced, and positioned to grow. Driven at first out of necessity, e-commerce has transformed into something that provides both convenience and limited interaction with others. The virus accelerated the growth of e-commerce, but the industry leaders I talk to say this is a trend that's here to stay. With more consumers shopping from home, how brands interact with consumers will change. Online grocery shopping often results in less impulse purchases, making in-store marketing activations less impactful. Increases in e-commerce also beg important questions about our on-pack approach to regulation. For years, policymakers and regulators have tried to squeeze more information onto the finite amount of space available on a label. But what happens when people don't physically interact with the product? When you can't pick it up and turn it around to read the details? Is it time for a new discussion and new regulatory regime around digital disclosure? We hope so, and we think that our Smart Label program is uniquely positioned to capitalize on this digital movement to provide the information consumers want to know about the products they bring into their homes. It's still an exciting area, and COVID has certainly fast-forwarded it. Two more issues to get through. The fourth is the point that it really sticks with the theme of regulation, and is probably one of the most significant points. The greatest failure of America's approach to COVID has been the inaction of the federal government and the patchwork approach adopted by states and localities. Our industry believes in smart, uniform regulation. We represent businesses of scale. Most of our industry is national, if not multinational. And it's simply not feasible and efficient to manufacture differently in New York than we do in New Jersey. The last 6 months have demonstrated how necessary consistent, clear policies are to maintaining public health and keeping businesses up and running. As an essential industry, we have to keep operating. As COVID was rapidly spreading across the country, our understanding of the virus was growing and guidance was constantly changing. It was a race to keep up. We recently surveyed our member companies and found that nearly 2/3 were receiving guidance from the government multiple times a week. Each time they had to pivot what they were doing. Worse, they were often receiving one direction from the state, another from the locality, and still another from the federal government. Nearly 2/3 of companies said that the conflicting guidance from federal, state, and local sources was problematic as they worked to address COVID concerns and protect their workforce. It's no surprise that there was near universal agreement across the industry that it would be helpful for state and local governments to follow federal guidance, creating uniform expectations for their manufacturing facilities. Simply put, an industry of scale needs regulation of scale. This is one of our top agenda items. How do we drive smart, uniform regulation? And COVID has proven why this is so important. From keeping essential facilities open during times of crisis, to building a workable recycling system in the United States, where we currently have 10,000 different recycling jurisdictions, to regulating CBD, which isn't happening anywhere, expect to see a big push from us on why the federal government needs to become more assertive in order to empower our business to meet consumer demands. Finally, let me close with this. It's never too late to learn. That's been a message within the industry, and it's a message we'd like to see the government adopt as well. COVID forced the industry to revisit everything it does and how it does it, creating enormous new efficiencies to meet unprecedented demand. From SKU reductions to maximizing food service production lines, to adapting the way that direct store delivery professionals supported their customers, our industry learned new ways of doing business. And with those lessons in hand, it'd be crazy to default to the old way of doing business as the crisis disappears. The same should be true for government. The truth is that the federal government took some important steps during the crisis, such as increasing the hours that truckers could drive, increasing the amount of weight allowed on those trucks, and changing the ways that some inspections are handled at facilities. In each instance, the new approach proved to be equally as safe and effective. And just like in the private sector, it would be crazy to default to the old way of doing business as the crisis disappears. But that's what government tends to do, and that's what we have to prevent. Recently, Consumer Brands published a list of 10 COVID-related policies that we believe should be made permanent. Our simple ask is that government be as nimble as our companies have been, building on the experience of the last 5 months. That may be a lot to ask, but we're certainly going to stay on top of it. There will be no rest. While the panic buying of March was unprecedented, May purchases were still up another 4% over April, and they rose again in June, proving that the demand for CPG products was not a symptom of a moment, but rather will be with us for a long time. In total, consumption is up nearly 10% across the industry, and many companies are reporting much larger numbers. We got a lot of work to do to meet that consumer demand, and we're confident that these 5 takeaways create a roadmap for our industry's continued success. It's our aim to be an industry people can count on throughout a difficult time and long thereafter. And we're proud to be delivering on that responsibility every day. And I'm thankful to Ipsos for the chance to share these key takeaways today. Thank you, Oscar.
Fantastic, Jeff. Thank you. I think some really good themes around food that we can dive a little more deeply into. I want to spend some time now with Julia Oswald. She's Vice President of Decision Science and Analytics at one of the storied, trusted brands you spoke of, Jeff, at Kellogg's. She leads global insights and the global commercial analytics teams, where she works in partnership with commercial leaders. She's dedicated to building insights and analytics platforms that will accelerate Kellogg's growth. She's also earlier led a global strategy insights career at Domino's Pizza, where she had significant experience in strategy insights and innovation, as well as with Pepsi and Kraft as well. So just a little bit of experience, Julia has. Welcome.
That means I'm really old.
I'm really experienced. I want to start, Julia, and this fireside chat with a little more around people's behavior, right? I think you're at Kellogg's. I'm sure you've seen a lot more buying over the past few months. People are cooking and eating a lot more at home. What's the biggest change you've seen in people's purchasing patterns as a result? What have you noticed in the past couple of months?
Yeah, I think if we could poll the audience, we probably would hear the same thing I'm going to say, right? Because I think it was pretty consistent what we did as a country, as citizens in the country. And we started really reducing the number of trips that we take to the grocery store, but our baskets got a lot bigger. So as we kind of look forward past this, as Jeff mentioned, there's been a huge uptick in purchasing of CPG and food, especially goods. And so some of those goods, like we're stock up, like the toilet paper, the hand sanitizer, right? We stocked up and we're okay. We're not continuing to buy those at that elevated rate. But a lot of the food products, we bought them at higher rates. We're not going to restaurants anymore. And so we're actually consuming that more food in our home. And so that plus 10% we're seeing across a lot of products, a lot of Kellogg products, a lot of food products in general. I think long term, I don't know what this means. It means that CPG generally is probably going to have a pretty good year, so that's a good thing. And for any of you who've worked at companies before where you've had a really good year and you're on the worrying end of the spectrum, it probably means you're really nervous about how we're going to overlap this the next year.
What do you think? It's interesting. You talk a lot about kind of the growth of the big CPG firms are seeing, and Jeff mentioned this as well. The trend we've been seeing the past couple of years is the growth of the small brands, right? So the LaCroix in the face of Coca-Cola, right? The RX bar in the face of Cliff Bar or Nature's Valley, right? What do you think is
no RX bar?
What do you think is the future of some of these smaller brands that were driving a lot of consumer interest for the past several years as do we still have trust in them? Are they going to continue to grow? And what does it mean for the large companies like yours?
Yeah. I think that, my general kind of framework that I've learned over time and operate in is that consumer value, what consumers value, is a relationship between the benefits that the brand brings divided by the price, what you have to pay for that. And so I think the trust topic that Jeff raised earlier, that's really added a lot to the benefit side of the equation for these big national brands that have long heritage. And so I think we're seeing an increase in value because of that. As we continue, and all of us probably had some challenges with our demand forecasting through those first couple of weeks especially, but the bigger brands with larger manufacturing facilities that have the luxury of actually maybe reducing their SKU set a little bit so they can have the right products on the shelf, that'll be another benefit, right? Am I always going to see the brands that I want there? And so the benefit, that numerator, I think over the pandemic will probably help the larger national brands a little bit more than the smaller ones, just because it's harder to maintain the demand load.
Sure. But one of the arguments, and I think something that Jeff said, is perhaps some of the smaller brands can more quickly pivot to increase changes in consumer demand, right? So suddenly we're on something with immunity, where a Kellogg's or a P&G, or like P&G doesn't make food, but a Kellogg's or a Pepsi takes a long time to kind of pivot and say that we're going to introduce a new SKU, versus some of the smaller brands can quickly put something out there, right? What does this mean for the future as, consumer tastes change driven by environmental factors like the pandemic? What does the future look like in terms of just kind of speed and agility for some of the big brands that you talk about?
Yeah, I think for any brand to succeed in the long term, it's going to be having good innovation kind of principles and practices and have some agility built in. And then probably coupled with a little bit of luck of having read the tea leaves accurately. So where big brands might be at an advantage is they've got bigger pipelines kind of already in the works. I don't know for sure for big brands versus small brands, but it's kind of be that kind of intersection of, let's make sure we've got a good pipeline of products coming in, and then let's, if you've read the tea leaves right, then you're probably going to have the right products on the shelf in June or August of next year.
Yeah, and I think, there's a lot of talk now around, okay, we need to introduce different SKUs or SKU rationalization. And the past few years have been going the other way, right? More flavors, more variations, keto version, gluten-free version. What is and Greg alluded to this, Jeff alluded to this as well. What's your view on kind of what's happening in terms of SKU count, and then especially in a world where we're limited in grocery stores, and in fact we might get fewer grocery stores in the future, right? To actually have presence.
Yeah, I think it'll be about, do we hit a second wave? Do we have another really weird, wacky demand cycle that we have to go through? I think I don't think the V recovery is not going to happen, right? We're in this for at least the medium term right now. And so some of the SKU rationalization that you're seeing the bigger brands do are the right thing to do to make sure that we have, product on shelf or we're not experiencing out of stock situations. But once we get out of this, right, that equation of benefits over price is going to shift around for consumers. And when we're no longer fearful of going out, what we want from our grocery foods are going to switch up a little bit. And so it really will be staying ahead of the curve a little bit on what those new demands are. And who knows what they'll be, right?
Exactly.
Who knows?
Yeah. And I think, what you touched on is, SKU rationalization. And I think there's been a lot of conversation the past few years around the perimeter of the grocery store, where people are going for the prepared food, the fresh foods, at the expense of the center of the grocery store. Now, what we feel like is the center of the grocery store is now expanding again, right? Do you think that's going to come at the expense of some of the other trends towards fresh, towards prepared foods, which is how a lot of grocery stores get their margin, right?
Right.
What does that look like from your perspective?
So that, when I was in the QSR space with Domino's, we were competing against the fresh foods of grocery stores and pizzas that you can get in your Meijers or your Costco. Absolutely. I think that's flipped around a little bit now, because we're needing to buy the packaged foods rather, because we got to get them all we got to make sure we have food for our families to eat every day. Mm-hmm. But as we start commuting and driving back to work, and it's funny, life feels like it's 24/7 when I'm online now, but I'm actually not having to drive anywhere, and I don't have these commitments of like, I got to pick Liv up for soccer practice at 6, and I got all this stuff I got to do and go around. And so those prepared foods solve that need, that big need that consumers have for convenience. When you're kind of in that rat race of trying to get where you need to get, pick up everyone, and also have dinner on the table at dinner time. So when we're living in our houses a lot more, there's less of that need for prepared food. But as soon as we swing back to doing a lot of commuting and our kids are back out in programs, that need for convenience has been a long-standing kind of rise in the United States.
Yeah, and you mentioned this kind of swing, right? When we go from being comfortable and go, are there certain signals you're tracking? I know you do a lot of analytics, obviously. Are there signals you're tracking? What are the things they're going to say to you that you're like, okay, we're heading back to, normal if there's such a thing anymore, or we're headed back towards this? Like, what are you tracking and what are you looking at?
Yeah, it's a bit up in the air. We're looking at a lot of measures that I'm sure everyone's looking at, the mobility indices that we can get from like a Google, the stringency index that's coming in from Oxford University. Yep. We've got some, as everyone probably does, some proprietary social search tracking that we're doing to see how different topics are kind of ebbing and flowing over time. So we're all looking at the same thing. My instinct, this is just my instinct right now, is it's going to take a while for us to get back to having 100% of the workforce in an office. Yeah. We might never get back there. And so I think there's probably a permanent change that we're seeing in the daily lives. I don't know if we'll have people that are working from home all day, but it'll be hard to get everyone back into the office because we can't stay 6 feet apart. So I don't know if we're going to have Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Thursday people. I don't know how that's all going to work, but I don't think we're in the near term going to be driving nearly as much as we did. And so that not driving as much has a funny impact on, your personal disposable income, right? If we think about the income continuum, the people at the top end of that income bracket aren't spending $200 a week or, depending on where you live on gas or parking or anything like that. And so your disposable income has actually increased. And so then maybe you can afford some of the benefit side of the equation, some of these immunity products or these other like higher end, and you could actually pay a little bit more for them. At the other end of the spectrum, the personal disposable income has probably decreased, right? Because that's where more of the layoffs are happening. And so the income level has really widened across that continuum and how much disposable income we have to afford to pay for these goods with.
Yeah, it's a tough story of we're hearing again, the rich get richer and the poor suffer more and more. On that topic, though, I just want to touch on one more thing before we kind of open up to the group here. There's a lot of news on the unemployment rate, the recession we're heading in towards. What do you think what's happening in the world of value for food, right? We read a lot about, food deserts. We read a lot about, to your point, the immunity fortified things that are probably going to cost more. What are we doing, or what's going on more on the value end of things for people who are unfortunately suffering a little more through this pandemic than others?
Yeah, let's hope that we can readdress the unemployment wages that folks are making that are unemployed. We've been a little bit, I think, lucky with the $600 that's been coming in because all of our consumers, there's not been a huge rise in food scarcity or a huge rise in households that can't afford to put food on the table. So that's been really, really lucky. But if that goes away and we think about really a drop in the dollars that people are spending for groceries, that could be very significant for a lot of our brands and our branded products. And I think if that does happen as branded products, we're probably a little bit more worried about the risk of just our top line sales number than our long-term brand equity. And this is where I also think the private label will come back in force, which is kind of what happened with the last recession. Actually, the rise in the private label happened a year or two into the recession when people realized, oh, this is going to stay. This is my budget. I don't have any more savings to dip into to kind of maintain my daily life. But it'll be tough. Let's hope that Congress can get their act together.
Yeah, the private label thing is and it's not just private label, but it's also giving rise to retailers, they're dedicated to their own labels, right? The Aldis or the Trader Joe's.
Right.
I would even argue a little bit of the we have one here in New York, the Amazon Go stores, right? The Amazon stores. So it'll be interesting to see how all of those pieces hold together. But thank you so much. That was super helpful. I think can we maybe broaden the conversation now a little bit? Let's invite a couple more panelists to join us and see kind of what other perspectives they have. I want to welcome RJ Hotby, who's the Consumer Equity Research Strategist and Senior Retail Restaurant Analyst at Morningstar. He specializes in consumer categories, including restaurants, online retail, apparel, consumer electronics, and consumer product manufacturers, which we're talking about today. He's also been an angel investor and consultant for many consumer-related startups. And so recently serving on the investment committee for Vitalize Irish Angels Venture Capital Group. So welcome, RJ. Also want to introduce Claire Hanlon, who is President and Chief Client Officer here at Ipsos. So Claire's someone I know well. She leads many of our consumer packaged goods clients with a focus on food, restaurant, retail, and beverage. So Claire's knows the industry well from many of the clients she works with, and I'm sure can speak to, change the slide there, speak to many of those business decisions that they're making. So RJ, let me start with you. I know we've been talking a lot about packaged foods and packaged food industry. Let's talk about restaurants for a while, which I know is a sector you cover as well. Obviously these CPG brands like Kellogg's have been thriving in this pandemic at the cost of restaurants, I might argue. And for a long time, restaurants have always been a big CPG threat. You are either on-premise or off-premise, right? Either at home or you eat out. What's your outlook for this pattern going forward? And what do you think is happening in the restaurant industry, right? We all know it's going to be hurt. What's your longer term view? Is it going to come back? Is it going to be smaller? Would love to hear what you think and then have anyone else chime in.
Sure, and thank you, Oscar, for the kind introduction. And you're right, we've seen a reversal of food at home and food away from home trends, which have been trending towards restaurants really for several decades now. In fact, in 2014 was the first time we'd ever seen food away from home, so restaurant spending outpace food at home spending, and really we've seen that continue through 2019. Obviously, that's going to reverse in 2020. A lot of people in the restaurant industry I've spoken to are hoping for a quick reversal back to what we'd seen pre-COVID, but I honestly don't think that's going to happen. I think what we're going to see is a lot of the trends that were already in effect, started before pre-COVID, are going to continue in the future. And the theme has been brought up in several sessions today, but the theme of accelerating trends that were already in play, I think that's exactly key to what's going on right here. I think, for example, online grocery, Jeff had mentioned it, I think that's a trend that's here to stay. I mean, the convenience factor of it, once people have gotten their shopping carts in order, that's going to stay. So I think that's going to be disruptive to the restaurant industry. The restaurant industry itself, too, is going through a bit of reinvention as it was. In a lot of ways, it reminds me what happened to the retail sector during the Great Recession when Amazon started making inroads during that recession, really started to see that prime member flywheel start to take effect. The restaurant space is going through that because of the delivery aspect, the third-party delivery aggregators that were there, digital ordering. So a lot of them are already starting to rethink, the look and feel of their restaurants, delivery platforms, everything. And so I think all options are on the table. I think if I had to sum up my takeaways for the space in 3 points, one is that consumer behavior is going to permanently change. I think, coming out of this, I think, in terms of delivery, accessibility, value, I mean, there's going to be a lot of changes in the restaurant industry right now. It's a little bit, it hasn't been quick to respond to it. 2, online grocery, it's here to stay. There's some wrinkles that need to be ironed out with the system, but it's clearly here to stay. And then as it pertains to the restaurant industry, I think we are going to see a much smaller industry. I think we could lose as many as 10 to 15% of the locations in the United States. That'll be probably on a gross basis. I think the net number will probably be less than that just because we're going to start to see ghost kitchens and other alternative formats kind of backfill that. But it's going to be a much smaller industry, but one that the survivors are going to see opportunities for market share capture. But I think the look and feel of restaurants is going to change greatly too. I think we're going to see smaller footprints. We're going to see more digitally enabled ways to access products. drive-throughs, expanded drive-through lines. I don't know, Shake Shack this past week introduced a 3 drive-through format, one with, digital orders and 2 with regular drive-throughs. Things like that, we're going to see a lot of changes at the restaurant level. So much smaller industry, but I think it ultimately worked for the better. I mean, I think if anything, the last recession taught us about the restaurant industry. It gave a lot of operators a chance to be more efficient, and I think we'll see the same thing here.
Claire, what are you hearing from some of your restaurant clients, and what are you hearing from the industry?
Yeah, it's certainly a tough time. I think, everybody, I would agree with what RJ said. The footprint, like manufacturers, the manufacturer SKUs are shrinking or looking to shrink and be more efficient, more effective. I do absolutely believe that restaurant, the market will focus in. But I also absolutely think that consumers really want an experience. And so there is absolutely a place for restaurants, and there's absolutely a place to be in front of what RJ was talking about in terms of trends. So digitally enabled and having an experience that feels different than being at home, and still offers a comfort and a safety that, if restaurants can get in front of it, like RJ was saying, it's absolutely going to be, something that consumers need to have in their lives. They're social animals. And so while it won't look and feel the same exact way, it certainly will be part of consumers' lives, because it needs to be. People don't want to eat at home 3 meals a day indefinitely. So while the trends might take a little bit of time and maybe we haven't figured it all out, restaurants have a place to play in consumers' lives, most definitely.
Yeah. Julia, you're nodding.
Yeah, no, I would agree 100%. I think we want to go out. We want to socialize. We also don't want to do the dishes every day, right? So we love going out to restaurants. I think as we went through the last recession, the small mom and pop didn't have a lot of capital to ride out lower traffic patterns. That's where the consolidation happens. So it wouldn't be too surprising if that's where the consolidation happens this time around too. It'll be a smaller industry at the end of the day. Last time I think we had a 15% drop in traffic, like on a per cap basis. We were going to restaurants a little over 230 times, and it dropped down to about 200. And we never retained that, even when we hit this year 2020. So that the number of occasions shrunk dramatically, and this time around they're closed, right? And we're going to have a tail end of probably a long recession, so it'll be super tough for the restaurants. But we're all going to want to go out.
It's funny, in China they had a term called revenge buying, where they knew that people had been locked up so long that when they were freed and they opened it up, there was what they called revenge buying, because you were trying to make up for lost time. But kind of what you said about restaurants is interesting too, because I think what happened in the last recession was also that's when you started coming up with all the intermediate, the interspace kind of opportunities, right? So it's not just on premise or off premise, it's not just at home or at a restaurant, but you're eating at Whole Foods, right? They have tables and they can pick up food there. And the same thing as I know we're having some questions now with clients to say, well, are you tracking at home versus in restaurant dining? And we're like, well, what if they pick it up at the restaurant and then eat it at home, right? So a lot of kind of what we've understood as spatial differentiations and delineations of either at restaurant or at home is really getting messy.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of restaurants opening up more outdoor space too. At least in Ann Arbor, Main Street shuts down on Friday night, which gives a lot more space for outdoor consumption to satisfy that need that we have to go out.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, there certainly is the demand out there. I think that there's no question that consumers, especially after being cooped up for months, there's a ton of demand. And it's not surprising when things started to reopen May, June, July, that we saw such a sharp bounce back in the restaurant space. Now, we've seen different degrees. I've been joking around. We effectively have 6 different recoveries going on in the restaurant space. At the top of the former employer, Domino's, the QSR pizza space is doing great. The bottom end, fine dining, which isn't open in many cases, doesn't have delivery, doesn't have to-go options, still struggling. But I think where most of the shakeout is going to be is kind of in the middle ground between especially coffee and casual dining. But the big thing is now we're transitioning away from a COVID-related disruption now to a macro-related disruption. And what's going to happen when consumers, can't, afford to go out as much? I think that's going to be the next big headwinds facing the restaurant space. What's going to be tough too is now as you look in the back half of the year, you're dealing with 50 to 60% of maybe the volume that you've done, but 100 to 120% of the cost basis with all the new things that have gone in place. That's when a real bloodshed for the industry is going to happen, unfortunately. Really, and especially as stimulus starts to run out both at the consumer and business level, that's what's going to be too. But don't disagree, there's a ton of demand out there, but that could start to get uneven as we look in the back half of the year.
Definitely. And if you think even, the capacity for people to go out on Main Street and have a dinner with friends and family on a Friday night, that's great. But how does that change when people don't have, like you said, the recession really hits the family's finances, but also when the weather changes, what happens in winter, when people can't can't go out once a month just to go out and experience something. So when you talk about revenge buying, Oscar, I think that there will be something to that, and somebody's going to benefit. What if, is there a way for restaurants and grocers to be part of the in-home meal in a different way than we have thought of before? So Julia talked about not wanting to do the dishes. Of course, that's always a benefit of going out. But is there a way to make dinner easier? Is there a way to get some of the prepackaged and fresh stuff delivered to your home within 2 hours so that that it feels in home, it feels kind of takeout, or it could be a blend of, a home cooked meal with something that came from a restaurant. It could be, it's a really wide open space, and I don't think we've solved for it, but it's going to definitely be exciting.
Yeah. I'm going to pivot a little bit to come back to something you said, RJ, around e-commerce and the growth of online purchasing. I know Jeff talked about it as well, and I think Jeff said there's some kinks that need to be worked out. I have an interesting stat where one of our grocery store clients said they realized that people would buy stuff online for BOPUS, so they would pick it up, they would have to drive their car to the parking lot, get their groceries put in the car, and then 30% of them would actually then park the car and then go in the grocery store anyway. So something that's missing in kind of the online grocery shopping experience. Can we talk a little bit about what's missing there? And you mentioned it too, Julia. What's missing there, and how do we fix it? What's in terms of online channel? Everyone says it's growing, but then if you look at the satisfaction scores, they're actually quite low. So what do
Yeah, I think really two areas come to mind immediately in terms of what needs to happen in online grocery. I think it's here to stay, but I think brand discovery is one of the biggest things, and it's been fascinating to watch. The nature of consumer behavior as you shift from going into the store and seeing all the brands on the shelf to online when you have that unlimited shelf, and how the brand discovery process works and what changes on that front. Just digging into Amazon's algorithm, and a lot of that was based on prior purchases and what we saw happen because a lot of these small brands couldn't get distribution on Amazon early on, or couldn't get distribution in grocery stores. They would get placement or on Amazon search terms, and now we've seen a lot of the big CPG brands want to get in on that too, and pay for sponsored ads and put them at the top of the placement. And I think that's going to continue. I think that we're going to see, particularly the demand that we've seen for legacy brands, we're going to see a lot more spending being put onto the online platforms to be on that first search page. 85% of consumers don't go past that first search page when they are looking for products. So I think that's kind of the key thing is, the brand discovery process and how much marketing gets shifted from traditional means to online placement and sponsored ads. I think is going to be a big part of it. And then two, this is one that I think we all deal with in terms of that product when you place that order and one, there's no delivery windows, or it shows up and everything's melted. Logistics just clearly are not where they need to be, and that's across the board. And I think Amazon even would be the first one to admit that they don't have everything ironed out at this point. A company like this that's built on understanding peak seasons and stuff like that, they were even caught off guard and had to go to only essential products for a while. The spike in demand really forced them to take a look at their system. So I think that's where we're going to see a lot of improvements. And to be honest, a lot of innovation on that point. Supply chain, that's going to be a lot of innovation on the grocery store, online grocery. A lot of players thought they were ready for it, and I think they're realizing the reality they weren't. So that's kind of my two takeaways in terms of what the issues that need to be worked out, or at least kind of figured out at the CPG level.
Yeah.
The other weird connection in this topic is when we're trying to track if our sales are through online or through a traditional brick and mortar, and when Shipt is doing it, the data connections are super not accurate.
Right.
So that's another area as the analyst, as a data person, we really got to figure that one out too.
No, same here. Like, you ship your product to Kroger, but you don't know whether Kroger sold it to someone through an online or through
Right.
in-store. Right? Yeah. It's a tough, interesting space. One of the things we realized is you also have to think about the person's mission, right? When we talked to these 30% of the people that actually picked up their groceries and then went inside the store, they said, well, I'm making something new that I haven't made before. And so I kind of want to see what's out there and then get some ideas and put it together. Whereas if it's a recipe or something that I know the 17 things that I knew, and I just click the 17 things that I need. So it's an interesting, we might have to rethink how we go to merchandise and reach people depending on kind of the channel.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Physical grocery stores aren't going away, but how we interact with them certainly is going to change, like restaurants too. I think there's certainly going to be a need, but I think smaller format grocery stores certainly is an option for a lot of players to explore.
I think there's also a place for brand to play in that too, Oscar. Insofar as, we talked a lot about trust in the industry. Jeff said that trust is up for CPG. And if you think about how, branded products really serve to build that comfort for consumers. If I know that I want to make a meal for my family, and I know that I have trusted manufacturer partners, brands that I have in my home, if manufacturers can be part of helping me be innovative and making it easy for me and packaging correctly and helping me make decisions whether I go into the store, if I buy online and have it delivered, if the brands and the manufacturer can be part of how I better myself in moving forward, that there's a lot to be said about brands that can weather where we're going, because they'll obviously be invited back into our homes throughout. I mean, they're a trusted partner, and that certainly helps in a sea of uncertainty. It certainly helps make these kinds of decisions easier for consumers.
Yeah. So you talked about branded products. There's the flip side of that, where I would even argue, listen, in a time of recession, private label is going to take off. We had a little bit of this conversation earlier. So kind of where do we think things are going to net out, right? On the one hand, correct in times of, distress, we look at things that we know and comfort and familiar. We also saw that, we did some work here at Ipsos with people that, did online grocery delivery, and then of course they got delivered the private label rather than the branded product they wanted because it was out of stock. And 96% of the people said, I was just as happy with the private label, right? So what does that mean for you, Julia, and cornflakes, for example, right?
Yeah. It all comes back to this value equation, and the huge value I think that private label is, or the benefit that private label is generated over time, is much higher quality products than 20 years ago when I was working at Kraft, than what we're seeing now. So I think they've really stepped the game up from a quality perspective, and consumers, when the price is also lower, there's a lot of value there. So it is up to the brands and to the national brands of identifying what that benefit is that consumers are willing to pay for, and messaging it in a way that's relevant to consumers so they understand it.
Yeah.
But it's like there's not one consumer. There's this continuum, and some of the folks have a lot more disposable income to pay for these benefits, right? And some don't. And so there'll always be. We always need to take that. We all know this. That segmented approach, right? And really target that product to that segment that values the benefit that we're trying to sell to them.
Yeah, and tied to that, what trade-offs do you think consumers are going to make in the coming months, years, right? So one thing we studied is, in times of trade-off, consumers actually value little indulgences, right? So I'm not going to get my Starbucks coffee, but I'm going to get my Starbucks coffee creamer instead of my Coffee Mate creamer, let's say, right? So I'm going to pay more for the creamer, but I'm going to pay less for the coffee. So what are the trade-offs that you think consumers are going to be making, and what do you think are some interesting areas to kind of dig in? Like, we knew in 2008, 2009, actually ice cream did super, super well, right? So people are actually looking for ways to make up for the fact that I'm not enjoying too many other aspects of my life right now. So are there trade-offs that you think are going to be interesting and specific in the next months, years, as we emerge from COVID, go into recession, and other kind of all the things that are happening around us?
One of the big trade-offs in QSR the last time around, because we had that big drop in total traffic, but there was growth in breakfast, right? So QSR breakfast really took off, and it was because it was that little treat I can get on the way to work. Now I have to brown bag it. I got to bring my lunch in every day, and I'm not eating out as much at dinner, but I can swing by McDonald's and get a breakfast in the morning and be really happy about that. So I wouldn't be surprised as we start driving again that breakfast occasion might be a quicker recovery time frame for QSR.
It's going to be interesting with the breakfast day part, because that's been one of the areas that's been most impacted with the less commuters. I mean,
right.
McDonald's and all the other players that skew towards it. In fact, those companies that do have an expanded breakfast program have been slower to recover than, say, the traditional QSR players. And that's obviously going to depend on what happens in terms of regulation and everything else about being back in the workforce. But I'll flip that. I agree with that. But I think another day part's going to emerge as kind of our indulgence. I think that snacking, that afternoon day part, can become very important. That's already been a trend that was happening. Again, the idea of acceleration, we're going to start to see that more and more. I think that's where we're starting to see a lot of innovation for restaurant. I think that could be that indulgence. Hey, maybe I wasn't able to get out in the morning because I had to get e-learning for my kids or anything else like that. But in the afternoon, maybe I can find that moment to get that break. So to that point, I think Starbucks and the ice cream players, they can do very well because of that. Because I think that snacking day part, that afternoon snacking day part, is ripe for innovation and expansion.
And even the after dinner dessert snacking, right? Like I'll go out and get a $3 ice cream, but if I didn't have to go out and spend a $20 dinner somewhere, I think that's a really good call.
Yeah. Claire, you were going to jump in.
No, I was just going to reiterate the snacking. Snacking is no. I think absolutely right. Snacking is I think people are at home, so that not only do they have the opportunity to snack more, they're in their own homes, they're in their own kitchens. As the days go by, and this obviously will change moving forward, but it might be one of those behaviors that sticks. People are thinking about different snacks because they're in their own kitchen. Things it feels doldrum after a while when you've been in your house for a week, let's say, and it's you don't get a chance to go out and pick up breakfast, and you're looking for an opportunity to leave your house after dinner. So the snacking piece is very, very big, and I think it again goes towards that emotion. It's physical, but it's also emotional comfort. It feels like that emotional indulgence, and so if it's Julia talked about going to get ice cream. I'm a big fan of that, but how many times are you going to do that before you're going to look for some other kind of relief or indulgence? So there's an opportunity there that really hits.
Yeah, and it all comes together, right? We did some work before saying that in fact, eating 3 meals a day is actually a vestige of the Industrial Revolution, right? Where you had to go to the factory every day, so you ate before you went, you had a break in the middle of the day, you needed to eat again at the end of the day, right? In fact, now that many of us are information workers, we don't have that structure anymore, and what COVID has done is even further destroyed that structure. So as animals, right, what our natural state is actually more like, grazing over the course of a day, right? Cows kind of graze all day long when they see food, and that's, as animals, that's what we should be doing. And there's some nutritional research that says that's actually better for us, right? To not be storing and then using, but just have a constant state of metabolism. So just final area, I'd love to hear from each of you kind of where you think, what you think is something important to remember about kind of the food industry and where food is going in the next, 3 months to 3 years, right? As we kind of emerge from this. So would love to hear kind of just your final thoughts on the food industry, and I won't pick anyone. So whoever wants to go first, you jump in.
Okay, well,
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
All right, RJ, you're next.
I'll start us off. Kick us off.
Okay.
I guess my takeaway is that, a lot of times when we see big shocks, and if we go back to the Great Recession or the dot-com bubble bursting, those are the things that do permanently change consumer behavior. I mean, consumers are loath to change their behavior. until they're effectively forced to, whether that be macro, whether that be regulatory. And these things really do, when they do change, change happen, and the market tends to underestimate these changes or think that things are going to snap back to the way they were before. That almost never happens. And so I think, as a restaurant operator, as a retailer, as a CPG brand, be aware that these changes are probably here to stay. We're not going to see an immediate snapback. Just because we get a vaccine next year does not mean consumer behavior is going back to that the way we were, early 2020. So I think that my takeaway is that think about all the different ways these businesses need to change, because consumers' behavior is going to change. I mean, we will see reversion back to some tendencies, but not maybe in the same way that we were before, and maybe not certainly the magnitude. But I think the key takeaway is that consumer behavior is definitely changed because of this, and will continue to change in the years to come.
Claire, what are your kind of final thoughts?
Yeah, I think a couple of things, a couple of the things that Jeff talked about this morning is that, the trust in the industry and that the business and that the industry is up. That really says a lot in an uncertain world. Having an industry that's really trusted, it gives manufacturers the opportunity to kind of lead the way. And when we're paying attention and even understanding that we don't know exactly what the next 2, 3, 5 months holds, the population really believes in the industry. And so, I think people would be much more, would be enthusiastic about getting on the change train with brands and organizations that they trust. I had a second thought, Oscar, but it slipped. So go to Julie and I'll come back to it.
Oh, no, that's great. So what you're saying is that the big trusted brands actually have permission these days to actually push
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that's, not only in terms of, like RJ said, in terms of like what that business model looks like, how it changes, but also, what comes next. And, that's it for now.
Fantastic. So that's looking at you, Julia. Push hard, Kellogg.
I know, right? Well, I just kind of want to combine those two thoughts, actually. I think the world has changed. Back to our ice cream and afternoon snacking. That's probably here to stay, in part because we're not all 100% going back to work every day, so we're in our homes. And it's just such a great opportunity for national brands, restaurant brands, and grocery brands to really take advantage of that in a good way, right? Yeah. The consumers are wanting these products, and how do we get ahead of it a little bit, read the tea leaves a little bit, and identify those benefits and those immunity or whatever the health adds that we can bring to our products. And let's bring this to consumers, because that's what they're going to be wanting as we go forward.
That's right. That's right.
Fantastic. Well, good. Well, thank you, Julia. Thank you, Claire. And thank you, RJ. I think it's sometimes good to have a slightly different format, more conversational as we explore what the future of food looks like. For our audience, be sure to check out our What the Future of Food issue. I think you'll get a link to that. You can download it here as well. The next issue is going to be What the Future on Money, coming in September. But until then, have a good think about the future of food. So thanks again to our panelists, and thanks again to, I think we have several hundred participants, so really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you.
Oscar.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.